Hey guys, welcome back to Total Tactics FPL. Today's video is going to be the Game Week 17 cheat sheet. As far as the actual video quality, apologies if my camera is a little bit poor today. I am quarantining in a hotel, unfortunately, very close to the holidays, simply because my one of my family members has had COVID, and I will have to kind of quarantine away in the meantime. As far as the midfield cheat sheet, though, this is where we're going to start. What I will say is that some of the valuations of players within the entire cheat sheet is also dependent on some potential double game weeks in the future. So a team like Brighton, who don't technically have any double game weeks announced, could immediately or impendingly have a double game week fixture in 19 and beyond. So therefore, their value is a little bit higher rated than their fixtures might suggest. So do keep that in mind when you look at assets like Trossard and you're questioning whether Gross should be even valuated as highly as he is. As far as Andreas, though, starting with Fulham here, you do have, of course, a fantastic opportunity to bank on that double game week in 19. He doesn't really have any suspension potential issues for now, at least. He has had a few yellow cards, but I think Andreas has simply been one of the best enablers in FPL that we've seen in recent memory. And in open play, we've talked about how his level of contributions has actually improved, and he's still on most of the set pieces when Willian is not on them himself. So for me, Andreas, I think, is an absolute nailed option in my team, specifically because I'm not going to go for a 5 midfielder structure. If you'd like to forego it, I can completely understand simply moving into someone like Almiron, who's so well priced, and if you already have some value built in Almiron, I can understand also foregoing Andreas. If, let's say, you're also not very confident about Chelsea, and maybe you think Chelsea would have improved during the World Cup, but I think that's hard to believe because there's been so much rotation, so many players out in the World Cup, and not enough time to really build any kind of team stability or strength of form within that Chelsea team. So for me, I think Andreas has great fixtures, Crystal Palace and Southampton. For me, someone who should be nailed in most teams. As far as Almiron, similar situation here where I think he has to be considered and evaluated with, unfortunately, the asset bracket below, because there's options like Rashford, Trossard, and Martinelli, and these are all players who are in very, very similar price ranges to think about. Almiron obviously a little bit cheaper, but you can now afford a very simple and easy team because we no longer have to spend that sort of money within players like Trent or Robertson, who are so extremely highly priced within the defensive positions, and you do have scope to move into players like Rashford, Trossard, and Martinelli. And a lot of discussion has been placed around assets in the 7.x range, such as Zaha or Mount, or even Saka at the 8.x range as well. So I would say Foden is an interesting asset, but do you really need to go for Foden? I would say probably not. And if you're the type of player who's actually foregoing the freemium template and you're just simply picking one out of De Bruyne and Salah, you could actually afford a very, very strong midfield team that doesn't need to cut down in terms of budget and can still be very, very strong. So Rashford, Trossard, and Martinelli are all fantastic options for me simply because of that. Trossard has the potential double game week fixtures, and he's also just been a lethal asset. Someone who's actually also scored versus some very, very tough opponents this season, which is very encouraging to see when you look at Brighton and how they have some tough fixtures in Arsenal and Liverpool. As far as Gross and McAllister, I would actually say that their performances have probably dropped in terms of the actual output and also in terms of the underlying stats since Potter has moved on, because now you have so much more rotation within this Brighton midfield under De Zerbi, and I don't think that they're as highly valued, specifically Gross at least. I think McAllister could play a different role. We'll see what happens after the World Cup, but is he an absolute nailed-in player that you have to kind of include in your draft? Absolutely not. And the same goes for Willian, who's unfortunately just a rotation threat. As far as Rashford, though, I think he's fantastic. I've already talked about him previously, but you have such great form from him coming from the World Cup. Already scored within the EFL Cup game as well versus Burnley. I just can't see him faltering for the next 3 games. For me, he's the most primed United asset to own, specifically over Anthony, because Anthony for me hasn't shown much form as of late. We also know he's coming back from an injury and limited game time within Brazil. And as far as someone like Fernandes, she's just a little bit too expensive for me to even consider when you have such kind of top assets like De Bruyne and Salah competing very, very closely with him, and also Sterling having double game week fixtures. For me, Martinelli is one of those kind of essential question marks that a lot of people have asked. People have built value over Martinelli, but Odegaard has very, very similar underlying stats. And what I do like about Martinelli, though, I think, is the goal threat and the positional the chance at least to play out of position. I think that is very appetizing for him or any of the owners of Martinelli. So I would definitely forego that 0.4 to own Martinelli just for that added chance of potentially being someone in that position. We also know that he could still take some penalties, right? Yes, we've seen Saka take penalties this season, especially when Jesus actually draws the penalty, but there could still be situations where, let's say, if Martinelli is actually occupying that central third space and he draws a penalty himself, he could be taking the penalty still. I don't think there's actually been a nailed order within this Arsenal team just yet, so that's a possibility there too. As far as the 7.x options within Zaha and Mount, I would actually say with Zaha, he's an interesting option that I think a lot of people will think is an FPL troll. He has 2 great fixtures, and then obviously it gets a little bit more tough, but they do have potential doubles that could be announced in the future. As far as Zaha, he's still the main man for Palace and still actually the penalty taker. We haven't heard any news towards the contrary, and we've also seen some friendly fixtures already where he's taken penalties. So I think Zaha is still a top option. Next to that is going to be someone like Mount, and Mount is the complete opposite this season, where Zaha has already produced a lot of goals, a lot of assists, and Mount has actually really struggled in terms of performances, and also actually accumulating the correct amount of expected goal involvements for us to consider him as an asset. We have another competing option within the attacking position, like a Havertz in the forward position, but I don't really think that Havertz is someone that I would consider right now. I think Havertz is someone, for me, that is a little bit of a wait and see if he actually is able to do well within the Bournemouth game, and maybe I'd like to bring him in as soon as that Nottingham Forest game comes around. And I wouldn't really be super sold on Mount because you have such better options in Rashford, Trossard, and Martinelli, players who've actually racked up form and also consistency this year already. So I think Mount is someone who is very appealing because the fixtures are so good for Chelsea, but you might just simply want to go for these Chelsea defenders instead. As far as Bernardo Silva and Antony, these are both options that I wouldn't really consider right now, just simply because I think that they are either the 4th or 5th best options in their team, and therefore it doesn't really make that much sense to actually spend that much money for 7.x players when there are similarly priced players in their own teams that would probably perform better. With Saka and Foden, we've talked about them, where Saka, of course, is the main penalty taker, and then with Foden, he's just simply impressed in open play, but was very depressing for owners heading towards the restart with the World Cup. And I would say Foden has the capacity, especially with the resting in the FL Cup game, to start the next game in the league, but you don't have that guarantee going forward. So I think that is going to be one fear for some of the managers, but he has been one of the most exciting assets in open play. So if you feel like you want to skip Kevin De Bruyne, want to go for someone like Salah, and you don't really feel comfortable with owning someone like Saka, because you might think that the Arsenal fixtures are tough, which I would actually say is probably not going to be true, because I think Arsenal have been very strong when it comes to playing at home. So I would actually evaluate Saka and Foden very similarly as assets, and I would actually price Maddison and Kulusevski within the next bracket in terms of the tiering system. As far as Leicester and Tottenham, they do have actually some great games. Tottenham could also have a double very quickly, but I would say Kulusevski plays much more of a creative role for the team. Maddison is much more ball dominant, and he could obviously be a huge lethal threat, but they do have some tough games there as well, specifically the front loading of that Newcastle-Liverpool game. Maybe you'd like to consider moving away or into Maddison a little bit later when he has a Fulham and NFO kind of swing there. As far as the premium assets and the true assets in terms of De Bruyne and Salah, I think a lot of people have been thinking about Fernandes and Sterling simply because the fixtures are so good, but I still think we've seen so much more from De Bruyne and Salah this season. Keep in mind as well that Salah hasn't actually had a single penalty this year. I think he will get penalties eventually, and so I expect De Bruyne and Salah to perform very close towards each other, even though there's a consideration of how De Bruyne has double game week fixtures already nailed in place, and you might not want to waste that transfer going from Salah to De Bruyne anyways. So those are my thoughts on the midfield assets. Let's quickly move into the forwards. As a kind of prefacing point, I did talk about Havertz in the midfield positions when talking about how you can look at Chelsea and investing into 3 of their players to bank around those double game week fixtures. But I would say Havertz is just an asset I think is a little bit too much of a differential for me to even think about for now. We know Potter is the type of person to rotate. He was rotated even in the German national team, and I don't think he's nailed a place in this Chelsea team, even though he's impressed in certain games. I think he's just not consistent enough of a player for us to really consider when you have options like Martial, who's impressed all this time here with Erik ten Hag, and then also assets like Mitrovic and Adams who've been quite consistent, and then you've got some cheaper punts such as Nketiah to go with when you have much more consistent and more expensive options in Darwin and Kane that I think I'd be much more confident over at this time. So with Martial and Mitrovic, I think Mitrovic, obviously the only issue is that 4 yellow card issue, and then the potential doubt that puts him into a position where he might not start versus Crystal Palace. I do think that's actually quite a big positive, because yes, of course, there's a lot of talk about how Mitrovic is a bit of a hothead. He could get a yellow card, but I still think there's a great chance that he actually culminates and finishes that double game week 19 fixtures playing both those 2 games. So starting with Mitrovic doesn't sound too poor, and he, of course, is a very cheap asset anyways. You could actually think about starting with Martial first, saving a little bit of money, and then moving into Mitrovic if you think that's interesting around game week 19. But unfortunately, Martial just has a fantastic fixture versus Bournemouth there, overlapping with Mitrovic's fixture. So I wouldn't really think about Martial and Mitrovic actually as competing assets. I actually think that you should probably think about including both assets in your team if you'd like. As far as Martial, though, he just has simply a great run of 3 fixtures, and then you can shift him out immediately, and maybe even rotate him into someone like a Greenwood who would be playing consistent games potentially. Around that time, we get to reassess, of course, who the budget forwards would be. But that's the kind of position that Martial is uniquely put in FPL this season, where he could be a quintessential asset over these 3 fixtures, and then you can simply move away from him if he gets injured or if anything fails, because he's so cheap. As far as Adams, he simply has great fixtures, no double game weeks in the near future though, and that's going to be the thing that sets him apart as a second tier option. As far as Nketiah and Solanke, the reason why I've priced them as third tier assets is because we've talked about, and we've looked into Arteta's press conferences where he's mentioned that Martinelli could play in a centre forward position. I also think Nketiah just hasn't really been exciting so far. Yes, of course, the second half of last season, he was very, very impressive, but in open play this season, in some of the European games as well, I just really haven't been impressed by Nketiah, so I therefore just have to keep him as a third asset. As far as Solanke, the fixtures aren't good enough, and yes, of course, you can include him in your team because he is the talisman. He has that kind of benefit of having penalties, which gives him a huge security blanket. But do you really want to start FPL with him again? Probably not, and this is me, a Solanke ex-owner, speaking. As far as Wilson and Darwin, I think these options have been very consistent for different reasons. Darwin is someone who amasses a lot of chances, has ridiculous XG in the league, and doesn't really finish most of his chances, whereas Wilson is a very clean, clinical penalty taker and a great finisher as well, who's very calm. And for me, Wilson is interesting when he's not injured. That's simply the case in FPL. He's also super well priced. I'd probably actually classify Wilson as a better asset than Darwin, but then Darwin has just been equally menacing, and you could see that in the EFL Cup game versus City as well. And I think Darwin is one of those assets where he's probably going to be more explosive. He'll have high highs and low lows, and Wilson is a bit more consistent, and he will tick along. He does have equally tough games. I would say Arsenal and Brighton are probably quite tough games for both Newcastle and Liverpool respectively, but whether you'd like to go with Darwin, I think, is really up to your flavor for variance, and Wilson is a much more consistent asset if you prefer that in FPL. As far as Kane, he's the definition of consistency this year. I think we talked about Haaland mindlessly, and of course Haaland is the best option in the game, bar none, but Kane has been the pinnacle consistency this year when it comes to getting those very consistent 6 to 8 point hauls, and for me, I don't think Kane's going to stop with that anytime soon. So for me, Kane is continuing to be a top option. Whether you'd like to evaluate him over Salah and De Bruyne, I think, is a different issue. Unfortunately, of course, the midfielders have just more scope to get points if you're not going to get more than, let's say, 1 goal, which is unfortunately the territory that Kane does. The one pro that Kane has is that he is so impactful in the game in terms of creativity that he does usually stay around 3 bonus points even when he scores 1 goal. And that for me is the one thing that keeps Kane at the top there with Haaland, and he is worth considering over a Salah and a De Bruyne for me still. But whether I've actually kept Kane in my draft is not the case. I've actually decided to go outside of Kane for now, but I think he still could find your way into your drafts if you'd like to go for a 3-man template, especially, for example. Moving on to the defenders, you have 2 players here who are complete gap fillers in Bueno and Patterson. I wouldn't really evaluate them as top tier options, but if you want to kind of round out your team, and these are the remaining spaces in your team, so you can actually afford, let's say, a very, very strong team of 14, I think Patterson and Bueno should definitely slide into your draft. I'd probably prefer Patterson a little bit more, but I think Wolves have a good chance to actually exceed and excel as a team under Lopetegui as a manager. He's someone that I trust much more so than Lampard, unfortunately, and that's kind of the reality for me, whereas I think Patterson might be the more exciting player, of course. As far as the 4.1 to 4.9 assets, you have Ben White and Shaw. I think Ben White is the option that a lot of people have probably let slide under the radar because Gabriel and Saliba have been so exhilarating, especially when it comes to scoring goals and so on and so forth. But Ben White is so well priced, and if you were able to kind of capture him and his price rise before the World Cup had started, I do think Ben White is at a very, very good price. And we also know that this Arsenal team have boasted fantastic defensive statistics so far, and Ben White is someone who also gets that sort of benefit of getting an early clean sheet banked with the 65-75 minute subs that have been quite frequent for him. And we've also seen a lot of assists come through by way of him passing to these very, very kind of trigger happy Arsenal midfielders. So I do like Ben White from that perspective. As far as Shaw, though, it's very, very similar to the way you'd look at the midfielders for Man United, where he has such a great run of fixtures where he's so well priced. But the issue, of course, is looking at the clean sheets and the perspective of that, you have maybe Varane and Martinez missing out, and that could very, very much affect someone like Shaw and Dalot, because both Shaw and Dalot are options where you think that they can do well, specifically if they get that clean sheet nailed, because they get so much bonus points with that as a surplus. If they lose that clean sheet, though, that's a completely different picture, because other assets such as a Rashford, such as a Fernandes, slide into the picture and take away from the points of Shaw and Dalot. And I don't really think that this team is going to hold up too much versus Nottingham Forest. I know it looks like a great fixture, but that's going to be a tough one. I do think Wolves and Bournemouth will be more exciting, though. But then you've already got City going in the next game. So he could be one option to actually skip, because maybe the long-term threats and the actual positives of the double game weeks within someone like a Dunk, who's a tier next, is much more interesting, right? Because if Brighton get these double game week fixtures, potentially even triple game week fixtures, then Dunk just far excels as an option, and he's got the potential to be kept in your team for a while longer. And maybe that's more interesting in terms of whether you'd like to keep Shaw in your team as well. So I think Shaw and Dunk is that kind of position in FPL where you should be thinking about your fourth player and fourth position defender in a 3-4-3 structure, and not really be looking at Shaw or Dunk as consistent starters in your team. And Walker, I would say, is at a very odd position, because I actually prefer going for double City kind of attack with the midfielders or forwards, whatever variation that you'd like to go with. Usually just Haaland plus De Bruyne or Haaland plus Foden. And I don't really like a double City defense, unfortunately. I just think that the valuation of Walker is not high enough, because he has a very high chance of being rotated, and Cancelo is the only nailed player in that system, and Walker doesn't really provide much, even when it comes to goals, right? So when you compare Walker to other centre-backs, they've at least got a chance of scoring set pieces. You can see Nathan Ake scoring, John Stone scoring, Ruben Dias in time past, but of course he's injured, and Akanji, of course, recently as well, has gotten a lot of header goals, and I think Walker doesn't really have that scope. So even though Walker might be a little bit less rotation prone than the centre-backs, is there much value towards Walker as an option independently? I would say no. As far as Perraud and Doherty, these are both options that I think are appealing if you want to go a little bit outside the norm and just target teams that have good fixtures and potential fullbacks who could actually contribute to the goal scoring side of you. So even though maybe Southampton and Tottenham, we're not really seeing them in the best light as of late, because of course Southampton has been such a poor team this season, and even though they have great fixtures, you're expecting them to struggle in these games as well. Whereas with Doherty, of course, you've got rotation issues, and then also, simply put, I think sort of struggle with Tottenham's defense heading towards the World Cup, and I don't think much will really change, unfortunately, with that. So that's kind of the double-edged sword that you have with Perraud and Doherty, and I don't think that they're really close to some of these other assets, because they don't have all the kind of pros that options like Ben White and Shaw or even Dunk have at the 4.1 to 4.9 tier. As far as Gabriel, I think he's the best option at the 5.0 to 5.4 tier, and that's simply because he doesn't have to deal with the suspension issues that Saliba might, and also that he's less rotation prone than an option like Cucurella, who actually has double gaming fixtures much more front loaded to him. And I think Cucurella, of course, we've seen that his ceiling as a fullback is not as actually high as traditional fullbacks. I think his goal scoring, his clinical finishing is very lackluster compared to options like Chilwell and Reece James, of course. And then with Gabriel, you've got that set piece threat ability. So I think Gabriel is still going to be a top option, and very similar to Ben White, is someone that you should absolutely consider putting in your teams, even though it seems like Arsenal have tough fixtures. As far as the 5.5 plus area, you've got Trippier, Cancelo, and Reece James for me as the top options, and I would say Liverpool options for me are simply second tier. Maybe you could even consider them third tier, and Thiago Silva, I think at his age and with the potential to rotate so much, I would say he's simply going to be in the same kind of tier as Cucurella, because I am expecting Thiago Silva to be rotated, but he will be potentially the defender that I have the most faith in outside of Reece James. We already know Reece James could be rotated, but of course we've got the threat that is Reece James and his wand of the left and right foot, and so therefore for me Thiago Silva finds himself as probably the second best Chelsea asset to own from the defensive position. But if we actually go towards the goalkeepers, you'll actually see that I've rated Kepa as one of the top options, and exactly why I don't really think options like Cucurella and Thiago Silva should be considered, because I would say a double up of a Chelsea defense is already strong enough, and you probably want to include Kepa in your team as well. As far as Sanchez and Leno, these are two top options because Brighton have such a high potential of getting double game weeks, and Leno already has a double game week booked in game week 19. Of course, the Fulham defense have been pretty woeful, but their fixtures are actually very good, so I think there is good chances of Leno getting clean sheets. And as we know, with some of the weaker teams and the weaker defenses, any kind of miracle game where you can keep a clean sheet and actually make, let's 3 to 4 or 5 saves within a game, you've got a great chance of getting triple bonus points, and that might already be 2 or 3 or to 2 clean sheets worth of points compared to a keeper from a top team. What we have seen from Chelsea, though, is that they haven't actually been the best defensive teams. They've actually not been able to restrict the enemy teams and the amount of shots they're actually conceding and giving away. So I would say Chelsea is an interesting option because Kepa's at a very cheap price. He also had fantastic form heading towards the World Cup. Hopefully he can keep that. And I do think that Potter actually does have some faith in him for now because he's already shown a lot of confidence under Potter. As far as Ward and Iverson, still top options. Nothing really to talk about there. And then Pickford, I think, is interesting simply because they've just got so many home fixtures. And we have seen that the kind of way Lampard wants to play with Everton is not super ambitious. And they are specifically targeting these kind of low-scoring games and restricting the amount of shots that their opponents are taking. Obviously, there's going to be games like the Merseyside derby where it's very explosive and Everton keep a clean sheet and Pickford makes a miraculous amount of saves, and you'll still have those games there, but Everton are still trying to be a very defensive team. So I do think Pickford is a bit of an outside shout. Unfortunately, with the lack of doubles, he's not that exciting for me. And then with Ramsdale and Ederson, very similarly to how their teams are correlating in terms of the defense overall, I think they're top options. The reason why Pope doesn't feature here is because I think Trippier is good enough coverage for Newcastle, and I think he's nailed in your teams. Whereas with Ramsdale, maybe you don't have White, maybe you don't have Gabriel, but you'd like to go for Ramsdale instead as coverage of the Arsenal defense position. And that's going to be my cheat sheet for Game Week 17. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and thank you guys so much for watching.